I have the great privilege of introducing Shankar Sastry, who's I've known since 1999, on a software-enabled control program. Shankar received a master's and PhD from Berkeley in, I'm not going to say when. He holds faculty appointments, multiple faculty appointments in Department of Electrical Engineering, Computer Sciences, Bioengineering, and he served previously as the Dean of the College of Engineering. He also has served as chair of the EECS department and director of DARPA's Information Technology Office. He was a key participant in DARPA's software-enabled control program, and I think we actually have the Helen Gill, who was the founder of the software-enabled control program, is in the audience somewhere, and Helen was also my precursor at NSF, and invited me to work for this CPS program. The good thing about the term at software-enabled control and at DARPA is that the SEC program was really a precursor to the CPS program. And what I like to see is that we, Shankar and I, and Janos Stepanovich, who's somewhere around, looked at some of the research that came out of our software-enabled control program, including some of the flight demonstration activities, specific algorithms. We're really kind of front runners in a lot of that technology, and many of those groundbreaking concepts that we developed collaboratively on that program are being rediscovered today, almost 20 years later. So among honors, Shankar is a fellow of IEEE, and he's received countless awards. The biography is just endless. Many different awards. I don't know how many papers that he's got best paper and published throughout. The other thing that's really important is that he has a graduate tree that reaches deep into the CPS program, deep into the robotics program, and deep into controls that are really foundational elements of what we do in CPS today. And frankly, he's continued his DARPA work throughout with many of his graduate people are now part of many of these ongoing DARPA programs. So let's give a round of applause to Shankar.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and it's always great to come to a CPS PI meeting, so I feel privileged to be here, and I'm very glad that you recognized all the stalwarts of the program, and I think CPS is really, it's a great run. It's a great run. It's really, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about something that we call HATS, which is human-aware, human autonomous system teams. How do you model humans and automation working together, especially in a societal context? And it's joint work with some recent collaborators, Eric Majumdar, who got his PhD last year and is now at Caltech. Manchi Wu, who's here, she's on the faculty at Cornell. Lillian, who I think has also been a participant in CPS programs, the University of Washington, and Kshitij Kulkarni. And my own involvement is pretty modest in all of this. So, but let me just tell you a story about CPS before I start. This is the obligatory picture about spending on IoT and how it's going through the roof. And, before I start off on sort of talking about what that means, and I want to tell you about this term digital transformation, which is making its rounds in every corporate boardroom. But I want to say something about CPS and about David's leadership here at CPS. And as he correctly pointed out, it owes its legacy to Helen and Janos, who we are both privileged to have in the audience today. So I think around 2012, 2013, we got a NSF Frontiers project called Foundations of Resilient Cyber-Physical Systems. And in this project, we got interested in really thinking about mechanism design. How do you put together systems where the composite system has certain guaranteed performance? And how do you then try to make it robust to cyber and other kinds of attacks? And the interesting thing about this project was it was a Frontiers project, and then as it got started, I think both Helen and David were the program managers, the program directors for this. It attracted the attention of philanthropy. And Tom Siebel, who really had been supporting a lot of the universities, created an institute called the Siebel Energy Institute to hand out money to support people beyond the initial set of partners. And that was really wonderful for us because as we were doing these CPS programs, the NSF program managers say, make sure that you reach beyond just the team that's listed on your papers. And so that really enabled us to go forward. And it was really a PPP, really a public-private partnership, in that here was this philanthropist who put down really quite a substantial sum of money. I won't sort of drag you through the numbers and so on and so forth, but he really felt that he needed to take up the challenge that NSF and CPS had put together. And then going forward, we realized very quickly that at the nexus of IoT, the progress of IoT, cyber-physical systems, AI, and machine learning was a new kind of subject. And so that's this subject, that's this word called digital transformation. And digital transformation really has not been a staple of the tech community, but it's a staple of every boardroom. And if you go to the business schools on your campus, and perhaps some of you are in these business schools, it's a staple of these business schools. So what I want to do is to tell you that it's more than a buzzword that is used in corporate boardrooms. In fact, shortly after the pandemic started, Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, said in June of 2020, 3 months after the pandemic started, he said, we got done 3 years of digital transformation in 3 months. So it's certainly true that during this period, when a lot of other things have been slowed down, this digital transformation agenda has actually accelerated. And I think the scientific and sort of technology underpinnings of this are really very much are a work in progress. And so I'd like to sort of give you a sense of a few vignettes about what the challenges are. And I think it's a lot of opportunities which really build on top of the success of CPS. Okay, so let me start with an example. So the power grid is an example of a engineering system. Of course, the NAE called it the greatest success of the 20th century, building electric grids, and it has been sensorized. And people have spent a huge amount of money on putting IoT sensors all over it. The question of what you do with it and how you monetize this has been less clear, even though now, you talk about condition-based maintenance, you talk about how long it takes for trucks to roll up and replace parts before they actually fail, and so on and so forth. But that's an example of where the investment in censoring has gone beyond what the usage has been. Another big example has been in logistics and transportation systems. And here the story is quite rich. Certainly, Uber and Lyft were really quite instrumental in changing transportation from an ownership model to a service model. But now as you go forward, that's really got changed a lot more. We are now thinking about how we monetize space on the, parking spaces. So, parking spaces, used to have reds and yellows and greens and so on and so forth, hard-coded. And the question is, why can they not be software-coded? Why can't you actually charge differential rents on these? Certainly all the delivery services would love to have access to these. And how do you do this? So in a project with the City of Seattle Transportation Service, Lillian's been talking to them about how you'd monetize this. And how does IoT fit into this? As a convenience for people that want to park want to use credit cards to pay for their parking, we started putting authentication and radios on parking meters. But once you have a radio and a parking meter, you can also then start telling the levels of occupancy, and you can start talking about how you could change the rates of parking. You could do all kinds of things because it is now an IoT sensor basically on top of the meter. And so can you not do something like this? In fact, maybe we don't really actually need to have meters. You can actually enforce all of these as to have flexible zones, which can be used sometimes as loading zones, sometimes as DoorDash drop-off zones and Uber zones and so on and so forth. And of course, there are important societal considerations that come in. I'm not going to read through the slides. I'm just going to talk through it, and then I do want to show some equations, so then I will talk through the slides when I do that. But when Lillian did the study, the city of Seattle then first said, I'm going to try to maximize my revenues. And, that caused a tremendous outroar among the shopkeepers, because if the word gets out that the space in front of your shop is all parked up, that, it's not an attractive place to park anymore. And they said, hey, we pay taxes. We don't pay taxes for you to maximize parking revenues. So there's questions about what the utility functions are. It's become a bit of a habit nowadays, especially when you do AI and machine learning, to say, consider the following utility function, and let's optimize it. But that choice of utility functions is really pretty critical, and it needs to be adapted to take into account societal considerations. Okay, so what all this leads to, of course, is data is a commodity, how you share it. And, when we were talking about the intelligent agriculture in one of the panel sessions, the questions about ownership of the data rights, what we do with this, these are really, really important topics, other than fulfillment of the law. I grew up in India, and there was a persistent fear that among the poorest sections of the population, that when somebody gathered data about their usage patterns and so on and so forth, it was actually a subtle ploy to actually to maximize the utility of the benefits of the richer classes of society. Because, I'll show you examples of theorems about what this means. This is not like lefty rhetoric out here that I'm spewing, which is what I thought it was when I first heard this. So how you put together the mechanisms to use this data is actually critical. It has to reflect our values as a society. And so that brings me to what exactly is digital transformation. So digital transformation is really CPS plus AI and machine learning. And in fact, CPS always had intelligence, don't get me wrong. I don't think we've ever sort of pulled it apart before. The difference, perhaps, is that larger amounts of data, so you don't have to worry about statistics. You know, there's empirical statistics that you use instead of expected values and means and variances and so on and so forth. So that's the AI and machine learning part. And cloud computing is part of this story. Of course, cloud computing may well have had its day. You know, I shouldn't say this because, you know, it's still big business for a lot of giants. But, you know, I think that cloud computing isn't always, you know, for real-time applications, for CPS applications, for car driving applications. I don't think you'd want to put to the computation of the cloud and deal with the resulting time lags in order to do this. But anyhow, digital transformation is at the intersection of all of these diagrams. But it's much more than just talking about big data. And I know in a lot of universities, including my own, you know, there's huge numbers of data scientists and people doing, you know, being taught data science and machine learning and all of that. But it's much more. It's much more than that, because you really have to. The data is not just bits. You know, the semantics of what's in the data and what it's used for is incredibly potent. And it's incredibly important because it influences how you live. And in that sense, it's more than just algorithms. And you can see this, I think, in those of you that are on university campuses or even those in industry. You have to pay attention to the societal context of these algorithms. And of course, the economic impact is off the charts. That's a BCG chart about this. But let me just tell you examples of the kinds of issues that happen with the use of big data. The first thing is this thing called disaggregation. When we first started working with this, the notion of how do you use smart meter readings, that's the thing on the left, or cell tower readings on the right, to be able to disaggregate the level of usage of the devices in the home or the movement of people on the road. Amazingly, you can prove some theorems which say that if the sampling frequency is high enough, you can not only tell which devices are the plug-in loads, but in fact, at a high enough frequency, you can also tell which television sets are on, and in fact, you can even say what programs are on. So that's, you know, that's not a good prescription for privacy, and neither is it for being able to tell the motion patterns of people driving through homes. So why would that be useful? Because it could be that you use something like this to be able to provide differentiated services. You say, well, you know, I want to be able to do load balancing so the state of California doesn't complain about not having power in the summers and fall and so on and so forth. If somebody gives me a high frequency reading of their smart meter data, I could use it to do better load balancing. And so while I can't differentiate the product, because all electrons, you can say if you have a smart meter reading with high frequency, I'll give you a lower price. So, and so if that was a market, then you ask yourself, and by the way, this is a market that exists in a lot of places. I think it was first pioneered in Italy by Enel, the utility in Italy. But, you know, the problem about this is you can actually show that if you have such a market for the delivery of electricity, and it could be that people like me are happy to send out the frequency of their smart meter readings not every 15 minutes, but every 3 minutes or 1 minute, whereas big firms may be secretive about their power consumption and not want to broadcast their power consumption. But the problem is, in such a market, you can prove that there'll be free riding. Free riding means that people with the with the high privacy settings, which is low frequency measurement of data, are actually getting disproportionate benefits for the amount that they're giving up by in terms of demand response. So, you know, this gets me back to this thing that I said. You know, if you had a sneaking suspicion that me, little guy, giving high frequency data about my about my energy consumption, ostensibly for power balancing, is a good idea, then you see that there is, in fact, free riding that causes it. So the question of how you address this free riding is an issue. And so these are all addressable, but that's why this issue of how you build services around these models are critical. Now, you know, there's a parallel of this for ride hailing and so on, and as you go through the talk, you'll see some of these. So here's an example of why, as you think about how the society is transformed, be it energy systems, be it transportation systems, healthcare, smart agriculture, by the way, is really a fantastic area, and I really applaud David's program and the investigators for jumping into this. Okay, the other thing is that, you know, when you put out these algorithms and you expect that people will sit and take these AI algorithms, what I want to show you is that when you put out automation algorithms, people don't sit and have that AI be done to them. They adapt their behavior. So let me give you an example. This is due to my colleague, Alex Bayan. It's about, you know, Alex Bayan was one of the people that pushed Nokia to use Nokia cell phones to get traffic data, and he used it to provide location-based services. And of course, this is now in Google Maps, Waze, all kinds of things. And so, you know, these routing services, they're hugely interesting and useful. In the beginning, people say it's wonderful to have these, you know, it's going to be great to provide better routes, there's going to be less pollution because people are not going to know what they're going to do, they're going to choose routes which avoid congestion. And then more and more people start using it. And there were quotes from Mayor Garcetti, Los Angeles, you know, saying, Viva, viva, viva to these apps. And then as more and more people see it, and some of you probably have this impression, I certainly, the leafy side streets close to my house suddenly became busy thoroughfares because, you know, it was part of the optimization of Google Maps to get around traffic congestion. And then, of course, people started trying to say, hey, you know, this is caused by Waze, and they start putting homemade stop signs or try to discourage people, start putting speed bumps and so on and so forth. And then finally it goes all its way back up to the officials and saying, you are the nasties who let in, and by the way, it doesn't improve the pollution. These are stuff out of headlines, these headlines of a certain vintage. So how does one resolve these things? And the way you resolve this is, amazingly, from having the right kinds of theorems and to give people the right dials to be able to think about them. So I think regulation and policy need to be inspired by the kinds of analysis that comes. A pet peeve, by the way, about technology policy is that technology policy is often retrospective, which means that you look back at yesterday's technology to determine tomorrow's policy. You know, we need to educate our own students and public policy students about not where the hockey puck is today, but where it's going towards in terms of the technology, the hockey puck being the technology, to be able to find policy for where the technology is evolving. And that, I think, is something that comes out of the work we do. Okay, so now a few equations, and you're going to give me the hook at 45 minutes total, right? David, you're going to give me the hook at 45, yeah. Okay, let me tell you about humans adapting their behavior to AI and ML systems, and how do you analyze this? And a few vignettes. Before we do that, let me give you an example of how bad things can go. Here is this notion about, you know, the very first thing is a central tenet assumes that the past is representative of the future. And that's what the traditional machine learning, they look at past data and figure out what the patterns are and use it for the future. But if I told it to you this way, I mean, it sounds terrible. You know, why do you want the future to be like the past? I hope you don't, because, I mean, for example, if you use this in hiring data applications, you'll have a workforce in the future that looks exactly like the biased workforce of the past. And so, you know, this whole tenet of using past data to provide future observations is flawed. And so you've got to do something to put this together. And here are some examples of the kinds of things it can cause. The first one is it's an example due to the city of Oakland. You know, it's right next door to where I live. It's this notion of using cameras to detect crime. It's called predictive policing is what it's called. It sounds really good. I got to figure out where the crime is and get cops there before the crime can occur. You know, sort of like, I forgot what the Hollywood movie is called, you know, where they catch the person before he commits the crime. I forgot. It's Minority Report. Super, yeah, exactly. You know, we were doing a cybersecurity center, and Fred Schneider told me, today's Hollywood is tomorrow's. Today's Hollywood. Yesterday's Hollywood is today's headlines and is tomorrow's technology. So it's okay. So predictive policing. So predictive policing said, well, we're going to use AI and machine learning to figure out what the crime statistics are and put more cameras where there is more crime. That sounds like a great idea, right? Because you're going to be able to. Certainly, that's what it means to use past data to determine whether there's more crime. And of course, the outcome of that is that, of course, you can detect more crime where there's more cameras. In psychology, that's referred to as reinforcing the bias. The number of crimes is a density. And so when you oversample some pieces of it, of course, you know, you'll get a greater number. So the questions about how you take the data as training data, so this program is actually abandoned by the city of Oakland after it was found that it actually reinforces bias. But, you know, it's used in all kinds of cities. You know, I was a tourist, finally, in Rome last summer, and the city officials were telling me with great glee about how they had put help booths in the city of Rome based on where they thought the demand was. A similar thing, it was probably a little more benign than predictive policing. But there too, you know, it just sort of reinforces bias. Another one, sometimes it's very different. So this one is San Francisco Airport. This is a Uber application. There's something called Surge Club. So what this consisted of is a bunch of drivers who would go to San Francisco Airport and turn off their meters, so it would create a artificial scarcity that would bid up the prices. I don't know if it's there on this slide, but you know, they'd bid up the $50 cab ride to downtown San Francisco would go up to $500 because of the pricing scheme of Uber. And then suddenly, you know, once the price went up, they'd all turn on their meters, and of course they'd benefit from these high prices. You know, in some circles, like these circles, you'd call that a denial of service attack. In fact, even as we speak, there is a lawsuit in New York City called Zuber versus Lyft. Zuber is Z-Uber, and Lyft is Z-Lyft, and Z stands for zombies. And it refers to the practice of having zombie customers to upset somebody else's pricing scheme. Okay, so you know, you can do real analytics. By the way, some of you may know that you can collect this data about the motion of, it is available actually till 2021. It was all available online about having the motions of cabs, and you could actually analyze all of this. And where's Manshi? There she is. She has actually been analyzing some of this. I'll spare you some of that, but I now want to tell you that this particular area is really about what do you do with CPS systems and the technology. You know, there's nothing wrong with the AI and machine learning algorithms. It is true that I'd much rather have them have some causation rather than just correlation, which is the current version of it. How you do causation is completely non-trivial. That's very much a work in progress. I don't know how much progress has been made yet, but you know, it's certainly something that we're working on. But I think that there's also a way of thinking about game theory. And game theory is a way of thinking about how human beings respond. Game theory, I think, has had a rich history of trying to model humans interacting. It too, though, suffers from what I complained about in terms of having utility functions. You know, even as multiplayer games, there are different utility functions, and maybe it's not such a great idea. If you go to, thanks to the folks at UPenn, I got to talk to the American Philosophical Society this past summer, and in the American Philosophical Society, they actually have a rather dim view of utility maximization because they view it, among other things, as very male. You know, the notion that every single person wants to maximize utility has a specific gender bias associated with it. It's a long story, and there's lots of philosophy literature, very interesting philosophy literature about this. There's questions about Homo economicus, whether Homo economicus as a utility maximizer is a good idea. So they're all valid concerns and valid things. But having said that, a sort of mathematical construct is this notion of games and learning and decision-making put on top of it. Okay, so let me now talk a little bit about how to deal with humans in the loop. And I want to do a few equations. And just to tell you now, I want to narrow the scope. Okay, and there's something that David Corman would come when he was at site visits, and I want to sort of quote him to you because, you know, the problem with a lot of the game theory literature is very static. It's static, it's retrospective, it doesn't take into account time. Whereas, in fact, people are changing. And there's one thing that David would come and say at all the site meetings: if it's cyber-physical, show me the time domain evolution and show me the dynamics. And boy, was he right. Because the way that all of this needs to be changed is really, game theory and all of that is a very static view of the world, and you've got to start thinking about more dynamic views of it. I want to show you a few examples of that. Of course, you know, but now I want you to start thinking about things like TaskRabbit, Uber Eats. Everybody know TaskRabbit is, I certainly didn't know it until we started doing this. You know, somebody puts up a list of things that they want done, and other people offer a list of things that they can do, and then you got to try to match them. That's what TaskRabbit does. And of course, all the others, ride shares, Robinhood, of course, is stock trading. Okay, so I think that when you have these, it's not just humans, it's not just the algorithms, but it's the humans interacting with the algorithms. How do you model it, and how do you then think about what the outcomes are? Okay, so, and this is the stuff that all this recent work, these are papers, some of which haven't, they will appear, I think. Some of them will appear, others will get clobbered by anonymous review, but you know, I think that they're all about how humans and automation. And I want to give you, it says 3 vignettes, but I want to do 1, 2, and there's 2A and 2B, but I'll stop at 2A, I promise. You know, I know everybody has the sinking feeling when you see all these slides and you're exhausted already halfway through the talk. Okay, the first one is about how do you align societal objectives with individual objectives. So this again is a problem that the game theoretic version of this is you say everybody tries to maximize their own utility, but society's benefit maybe the sum of everybody's utilities, and maybe the sum of everybody's utilities plus a penalty function for environmental factors, externalities. And the gap between those is sometimes called the price of anarchy, or sometimes it's just the difference between societal good and individual good, the Nash equilibrium associated. And so how do you bridge that gap is a question of, and I want to do this in the context of transportation, in the context of tolling. And the second one is more about how do you do this sharing? How do you do distributed services like this TaskRabbit? And what is the dynamic version of this? Okay, so dynamic tolling. So dynamic tolling is certainly all the rage. Singapore, London, they want to do it all over, and they want to do it, you know, the party line is tolling improves congestion, reduces pollution, all of those are true. But as somebody designing this, you got to be cognizant of a few things. You got to be sure that they actually do what you say is advertised, and at the same time provide the right incentives for people to pay tolls. And the other thing you should pay attention to is that tolling, any form of congestion pricing, is fundamentally regressive. So what does regressive mean? It means when you pay taxes, not only do the taxes go up with your income, but the rate of taxation goes up with the income, and that's called progressive taxation. Regressive means that poor people pay exactly the same tolls, regardless of their income levels, as wealthier people. And in that sense, all congestion pricing is regressive, and you've got to try to, as a society, you've got to decide what you're going to do about this. In some societies, they're certainly not talking about it in Singapore and London and even New York City now, but you should think about what you do with excess profits when you do this and how you return this. And that's something that Manshi, with her current set of undergraduates at Cornell, is trying to think about. Okay, but let me first talk about how do you design tolls so as to bridge the gap between the societal equilibrium, and I see that Professor Malikopoulos out here, and we were very influenced by some of his early work at doing this. Okay, so how do you design tolls in a traffic network? And, if you do have dynamic tolling, how do you adjust the tolling? And what can you prove? How do you do it in some reasonable fashion, which both addresses this societal good versus individual good question, but also, the tolling does not fluctuate. Whenever you do this collective pricing, you've seen that there can be gigantic swings. Think Texas winter 2021, when people were asked to pay gigantic amounts of money for heating their households because of an ice storm that hit in other parts of the region. So, you've got to pay attention to some of those. And so, here's an example of the kind of work that you need to do it. I'm going to show it on a really simple story, but I'm going to show you how it's an example of trying to put dynamics into tolling so as to achieve these purposes. It's a very simple network. There's n different routes between a source and destination. We've since extended this work to more general networks, but let me just show you the theorems for this single network. There's an inflow rate, which is stochastic process, arrival rate lambda, and there's an outflow rate, meaning a fraction of what enters, leaves, and that arrival rate is mu. And incoming traffic chooses the link based on the amount of congestion. If a link looks congested, you try not to choose it as much as ones which look less congested. And the way you do it is through some of these functions is called a soft max. It's like a way of doing a max, but if beta goes to infinity, it becomes really becomes a max. And it's done in accordance with the cost. The cost has two elements to it. It's the toll plus a dollar value for the link delay that you encounter on it, and that's this term in blue that you put down there. And in this work, we found out something that, if you actually pay attention to updating the tolls at a slower rate than you update the congestion, then having this time scale separation actually enables you to get some limits off this process and to be able to prove convergence to a certain amount and to be able to give an example, give bounds. Am I getting the hook? A couple more minutes, okay. So, I think that in this traffic business, they have these polynomial variations of the link costs, link delays, and so, the amazing thing about this is in the reinforcement learning literature, Vivek Borkar and a whole bunch of others actually had been proving very interesting theorems about stochastic approximations, which can actually be brought to bear to be able to prove ensemble properties from individual traffic properties. And I think in the interest of time, I won't show you what these convergences look like. These are for different lanes and so on and so forth. So, questions which would appear to be superficially very difficult to answer actually do have do have tractable solutions. So in the last 3 minutes, I will talk a little bit about TaskRabbit and dynamic versions of the TaskRabbit story. So, but I want to use this to tell you again about how you need to revisit a lot of the classical literature. So there's a problem that people talk about, which is about sharing. Okay. Let me just talk to you about matching markets. So that's what these things are. So what is a matching market? If there are people providing, people who want services, so you want to choose a certain restaurant, and there's somebody who is the list of restaurants. A is the agents, F are the firms. It could be, it was popularized for the kidney exchange programs, for placing medical interns in medical schools, all of those. And so a question about how, when people reveal, is also used, unfortunately, with some big errors for school busing. So there's examples of how you can really screw up by using the wrong algorithms. AIs are the requests, and FIs are the firms. And so the question of how do you match, each one of them has their own preferences. The A's have their preferences of the firms, and the F's have the preferences of A's. And these colleagues of mine at Berkeley in econ, called Gale and Shapley, came up with an algorithm. Stable matching means we can interchange a pair, and they don't do, if they can't do better. It's sort of the stable matching is like a Nash equilibrium for this particular scenario. And so the Gale-Shapley algorithm is a wonderful algorithm. It says everybody starts unmatched. Then each agent queries the most preferred firm, the most preferred service provider that he or she wants. Then that has not rejected, and of course the firm gets a list of requests and it rejects everybody but the most preferred A. And you go through this in multiple steps. And it can be shown that it converges a polynomial time and decentralized algorithm, and it maintains privacy. So those are the properties of the Gale-Shapley algorithm, and it actually got a Nobel Prize for this work, and it's a wonderful theorem, and there's absolutely nothing to complain about. And here are its features: decentralized, no coordination, no communication, and converges to a stable match if one exists. If there are multiple stable matches, this question of which stable match you converge to is non-trivial, because some matches are worse than other matches. That's the busing example that we talked about. The pessimal matches and optimal matches, whether you converge to an optimal match or a pessimal match, is not something that this algorithm guarantees. Okay, so coming back to this, what if you don't know your preferences? You're a diner, you want to go to a restaurant, you don't actually know which restaurant you like best, but you'd like to query them and get an answer about how good they are. And so, when you see a problem like this, then you've got to do a certain amount of learning. And the closest parallel to this is this theory of bandits. You go to Las Vegas, and then you look at all these bandits out there, you got to decide which one to pull. And then you do this by learning something, by trying them all out, finding the utility functions associated with them, and then choosing the one which is best. So by combining the Gale-Shapley algorithm, and now I want to spare you all the details of the specific kinds of bandits that are associated with this, you can come up with a way of doing the dynamic matching. And the dynamic matching is important because, in a lot of these applications, you got to allow for people to change their mind. You can't assume that people's preferences stay put. By the way, preferences are the first way that you really start whittling down this notion of a utility function. You're really moving away from utility functions to preference relationships and making it a relationship and so on. So, there's a lot to say about regret maximization and all of that, and just in the interest of time, I won't tell you that. But you can come up with a very interesting set of analytical procedures. These are called stochastic bandit algorithms. They're called adversarial bandit algorithms. And again, if I didn't have so much of a story to tell you before, I'd be showing you this theorem about this. So you can actually come up with an algorithm where the regret grows as log t, where t is the amount of time, which is sort of the best it can be. Okay, so, and this works for a class of algorithms. Okay, in the interest of sort of letting guys have a little bit of time to speak, I won't go all the way to the end of the algorithm, end of the slides, but let me just sort of conclude by saying, if there's one thing I want you to take home from this, it is that, to this crowd in CPS, the distance to incorporating a lot of the adaptation and learning of the machine learning algorithms, it can be incredibly productive. But it's much more than just taking your favorite bandit algorithm or your favorite machine learning algorithm and plugging it into a CPS system. Because you really have to think about the societal context of what it does and think about the implications of what it is for the societal system. And then if there are problems, to redress them. If there's a gap between societal equilibria, societal needs and the individual equilibria, you do redress. There's taxation, there's lotteries, there's lots of ways that you could do the redress. And the reason it's so critical that we do this is because, we're at a time in history that all the science and technology that we do is actually being deployed faster than we can even keep up with it on real systems. DoorDash is delivering food to you today using matching algorithms. Uber, by the way, Uber and Lyft, their basic algorithm for matching drivers and ride requests is a matching algorithm as well. It's not a distributed matching algorithm because someone's trying to maximize the revenues of Uber in this, or Lyft in this, Ola, or, I'm not trying to single out any one company for here. So I think that paying attention to the societal context of these cyber-physical systems is really critical, because what's at stake here is really to build in our values into the mechanisms that go in. It's not an accident that, when I first heard it, the economists calling it mechanism design, I thought, gee, that's what we teach in mechanical engineering departments when we design them, tell them how to design robots and linkages. The mechanism designed for how do you architect societal systems. So I think it's a very rich area. Even though human beings are difficult to model, and even though I was pessimistic about human beings not being Homo economicus not being maximized, Herbert Simon said human beings are sufficers, not optimizers. The cognitive psychologists are a lot more optimistic than us. They actually do believe that writing reasonably simple models of humans interacting with automation can, in fact, be quite representative. And so I think that we're just going to have to roll up our sleeves and try to model what it means for humans to interact with optimization. I think utility maximization is a start, and certainly not the end. So thank you very much, and I'll take questions. Yeah. I couldn't find a microphone. Okay, I'll repeat your question. How's it?
Taking at the gate. Thank you very much. Unlike the tolls, we are doing ground delay. So that's the mechanism designer. How do we manage congestion and so on? That's a game host. It's a centralized game host or mechanism designer. And then our game player will be the airlines or flight operators. They file their route or adapt their departure time. Similar like in ground transportation, you choose your route, but we also choose our departure time or start time. So in your setting or in our setting, we have a centralized, like an upper level mechanism designer, and then we have a lower level multiplayer. Actually, every flight is a player. So multiplayer game. As you said, there will be some sort of equilibrium achieved. But the problem is our high-level traffic manager, their decision is, sequential decision-making, but also under uncertainty because they need to manage their airspace capacity. The airspace capacity is changing due to weather. So they are hedging against the weather, against the stochasticity. At the same time, because the low-level agents, they are changing their route, they are changing their departure time, so the demand will also have some capacity. At the same time, both level players, they are moving, like both are sequential. So that problem, from the computational study, we didn't found any, elegant convergence there, but I just want to echo what you talk about today, so it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, but let me respond to you about air traffic. So air traffic is a poster child of how air traffic ought not to be. I really think this policeman in the sky, and that to 20 regional air traffic centers and all of that, is nothing, is really no prescription for achieving either of the goals that you stated, capacity maximization, and it is fed to us as being critical for airline safety. That's what you're told. But on the other hand, you'll have a ground delay in Newark for 3 hours to go to San Francisco because of a weather delay. Until you get to San Francisco, it's bright and shiny because the time delays. It's not the weather today. Is the weather when you get there that's important, and which is not taken into account with the system. So you might argue then that we do, and I think a lot of people are arguing for this, and as you know, NASA Ames is thinking about a new UTM concept for being able to take this into account, where the point of view is much more like a multi-agent reinforcement learning game, MARL, which has these. By the way, we play multi-agent reinforcement learning every day when we get on the roads. And safety is, of course, an issue. We do run into each other, and perhaps it's not as acceptable for aircraft to run into each other. But there are safeguards that you could do without compromising safety, but to meet these goals. I know your center works on eVTOLs. When we do start thinking about air taxis or air ambulances or whichever your favorite thing is for getting the third dimension into our transportation networks, I don't think we're going to have the luxury of doing air traffic control. And by the way, on the air traffic control, throughout the entire pandemic, the whole Washington, D.C. air traffic control was managed out of Chicago because there weren't enough traffic controllers in Dallas because of COVID. And so we already, you don't have to be in Washington, D.C. to be a policeman about the Washington airspace. So I do think a particularly egregious example of how things ought to be different. And as you know, there is I'm sure this is all politically incorrect, but there's a tug of war between the FAA and NASA about new concepts that need to come into a next-gen air traffic management system, which I think could undoubtedly use some of these features. Of course, you got to steer around weather, but okay, they've already probably gotten myself into enough trouble. But I think air traffic has a long ways to go. Management.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
So I wanted to, first of all, the idea of multiple utility functions, and this is one thing I remember at a workshop with Andreas, it's not just all about optimization, because everyone may have a separate utility. And traditional routing as well as congestion pricing or congestion parking, is truly unfair. And as you point out, there are remedies to that, such as lotteries giving people opportunities. And that becomes a very critical element in our Smart and Connected Community program. So that's kind of, and intangibles like people freedom to decide, I need to go somewhere. Why do I need to wait? Because if one did an optimization, car ownership is a bad idea. Yet, it's a great idea because of I want my freedom to go where I want to go at the time that I choose. So the human element as a way of working with CPS is really, to me, is kind of a next generation. And one of the current federal priorities is innovation for equity, which is kind of, is one of the top line federal R&D priorities, along with climate change.
Yeah. I couldn't have said it better about, when we were talking about the ag programs, and I'm sorry I'm not an expert in ag, but Naira, I don't think Naira is here, Hoa Kimian from University of Illinois. So she was telling me that one of her bugaboos is that farmers actually want to comply with carbon dioxide emission standards, but they just don't know how much carbon dioxide and methane is being emitted by different fields. And so the question of, and then to find trade-offs between how they trade it off. So it seems to me that as we do things like equity, societal equity, climate justice, all of those, we better give people the tools to be able to sort of trade off their desires with what is good for society. And in Naira's case, she was just telling me, nobody is able to tell the farmers how much methane's coming out or how much carbon dioxide they're emitting. And so there's questions about how you bring sensor readings and mechanism designed for them. I know she's working on this, so let me not steal her thunder. She's on your program, right? Yeah. She has been, yeah. All right. Okay.
So I want to give Shankar a hand. So I think Frankie, we have our next element is mentoring, right? Yes. So I think there's a panel and a session lead who's going to tell everyone what it's about.